I am really unwell at the moment, and I have been for quite a long time. I've mentioned this in videos before, but it just seems to be dragging on and on and on. What happened was I had food poisoning, and that led to what the doctor has said was post-infection IBS. My bottom has turned into Hal from 2001: A Space Odyssey, and it just won't shut the pod bay doors. This has meant extended time in the bathroom, sitting and doing absolutely nothing. And you know what? I'm not the sort of person who likes doing that. And I don't like to take a paper or a book into the loo as well. But I did think that maybe I could take a gaming device up there. I want something which is powerful enough to play a decent amount of systems, but not something that I'm going to want to use on a regular basis. Because let's face it, if I was regular, I wouldn't have the problem. I need the perfect go-anywhere device that I have something to play when I need to go. Anywhere. I haven't eaten much recently as well. I'm surprisingly hungry. Now, I should have done, I suppose. I've been told, particularly for today, to hold off until the evening. I'm not entirely sure why. You follow your doctor's advice, don't you? But it does mean I'm rather hungry, and I have found it's been affecting me a bit today, so I apologise when it comes to this video, because something could go wrong. Anyway, I may have found that perfect go-anywhere handheld in the device that I'm going to be talking about today, and that's the MagicX 135. It's one of those handhelds where it looks like the design team had a meeting and then nobody said no. And I've heard people describe this thing as like the Swiss Army knife of portable gaming, but no matter how hard I look, I still can't find that little tool for getting stones out of horses' hooves. It actually has a very similar aesthetic to the Anbernic RG35XXH, and by extension, the R36H, which I've got here. It's roughly the same size, it's roughly the same form factor, except for the removal of a second stick and the insertion of a second D-pad. It's a bit clunkier, a little bit heavier, but for that increased size and weight, you get a massive jump in the available systems that you can play. And it has that one neat trick up its sleeve that transforms this device from just another vertical handheld into an almost James Bond-like gadget. And now I've said that, I realise that I should have said horizontal handheld and not vertical one, but you live and learn. You get all of this in a device which is small enough that you can easily fit it into a jacket potato, a hot potato, a hot pocket, hot patootie, a pot noodle. I'm sorry. You get all of this in a device which is small enough that you can easily fit it into a jacket potato or into a jeans pocket if you're not planning on sitting down much. But the most interesting thing about the MagicX 135 is actually what it's able to play. This thing's got a MediaTek Helio G85 processor, so you should be able to play a few PlayStation 2 and GameCube games. In fact, for performance, it's basically one step down from the Ayaneo Pocket Air Mini with a smaller screen and a 3:2 aspect ratio, which seems an odd size until you realise that 3:2 is actually the golden aspect ratio for handheld gaming devices. This is one of those units that's actually a little bit confusing, because on the one hand, it's quite small and it's not the sort of thing that you would think would play those higher end games, or you think that you might have a bit of a problem playing it. But on the other hand, it plays those higher end games and it plays them quite well. It's quite nice when you're playing them. And yet it's small enough to carry around with you on a day-to-day basis. But is it any good? Let's take a look at the MagicX 135 as we find out if it will put a spell on you or if it's all smoke and mirrors. I've got to admit, when I first saw this thing, I wasn't particularly excited by it because it looks a little bit like a utilitarian Game Boy Advance, something that might have emerged from a 2025 Russia that never actually ended the Cold War. It's not a million miles away from the R36H, but even that seems to feel a bit old by today's standards, you know what I mean? And there are newer, slicker devices on the market already for a similar price point. You could get the Mangmi Air X, the TrimUI Smart Pro S, the Ayaneo Pocket Air Mini, all devices that use their form factors as selling points. The Mangmi and Ayaneo even compete with this device on raw power. The MagicX even has a smaller screen, which is going to make some people question whether this is the right choice for them. I mean, let's face it, we're all getting older, aren't we? And, for many of us, 20/20 vision just refers to the amount of glasses that we've accumulated over the years. What we've got here is a MediaTek Helio G85 processor, 4GB of RAM with internal storage at 64GB. You have a 3.5-inch IPS display that runs at 960 by 640 resolution with a 3:2 aspect ratio and a pixel density of 329 pixels per inch. It weighs 189 grams and it includes a 4,300 mAh battery with USB-C charging. Connectivity comes via Wi-Fi 5 and Bluetooth 5. Storage expands via SD cards, which will support cards up to 512GB, which to me seems a little bit small because a lot of these devices will go up to a terabyte, but it's not the end of the world. You can get an SD card with this unit, and this is one of the few companies where I would recommend buying the cards because they ship with proper SanDisk cards. So you then have the choice of whether you wipe the card and start again, or whether you just pick it up and play using the provided games. And this is all running on Android 12 using MagicX's own Dawn launcher, which I've got to admit I actually quite like. The screen is 500 nits, which means it's pretty bright for general use, and it's fairly good in the daytime. There's a slight problem with the brightness slider, because that functions from about 100% to about 50%, and then it just seems to stop working as if it's reached its daily quota. This makes it unsuitable if you're trying to hide the light from any partners that might be sleeping next to you. But by and large, this is a really lovely screen with a 3:2 aspect ratio. And that means widescreen systems like PSP don't feel quite as cramped as they might do on a 4:3 display, but the 4:3 consoles like the NES, SNES, N64, PS2 don't feel excessively pillar-boxed the way that they can do on 16:9 screens. Many people call this the golden aspect ratio for exactly that reason. What you've got here then is a strong all-rounder, which it's got a bright and vibrant screen and it's got good colours that pop without it crossing into oversaturation. And that makes a lot of other devices at this size look a little bit inadequate. The only real issue is the size. It is substantially smaller than its direct competitors. And if you're having a problem reading the text on systems like the PS2, because those were made for proper tellies, then I'm afraid that this isn't going to be any better for you. I've been trying to liken the overall build quality of this thing to something else, something that's on the market right now, and my main comparison actually has to be Anbernic. It's using the same sort of plastic as the grey 34XX SP. It's got a fairly nice build quality, although Anbernic do seem to have the edge and a little bit more refinement in their casing. It seems quite solid and substantial. Although picking it up, it does feel a bit like a toy, and if you pick it up and rattle it, there's some sound coming out. Having said that, it's light and pocketable, and that's a big selling point to a lot of people. It's certainly easier to carry around with you than other recent releases, and it should be praised for that. The device has two D-pads, and they both feel pretty nice to use. If you're familiar with the 040, which came out midway through last year, you'll be familiar with these controls because the D-pads are exactly the same as in that. They're a little bit smaller and a little bit more angular than some other devices, but they seem to be quite responsive. The one problem is the addition of added diagonals when you're using this D-pad. The 040 actually suffers from the same thing, and so unfortunately, this unit doesn't pass the Kirby pancake test. This is the only console that hasn't passed in the last few months. That's a bit disappointing, to be fair. The face buttons, too, are reminiscent of the previous device. They're somewhat rounded, somewhat glossy, but they're pleasant to press. And yet they're quite quiet when you're using them. I actually quite like them a lot, because even though they're small, they don't hurt your fingers when you're playing for extended periods of time. And then we have the single solitary stick. And I want to like this thing because actually it's very, very comfortable to use. It's a Hall effect stick. It has that Hall effect feel to it. But load up a hardware tester and you'll soon discover that these sticks actually suffer from cardinal snapping. And I know cardinal snapping sounds like a priest with a very short temper, but this is actually quite disappointing to see in a device around this price point. Because what we've seen recently with units like the Magmi Air X are devices that don't have that issue at all. The one thing that you will notice about the footprint of this device is that it is completely rectangular, and that's because the shoulder buttons and the trigger buttons are actually sat inside the body of the console. They're flush with the plastic. You've also got some extra left and right buttons in the top and bottom of this device, and we'll come on to those a little bit later on. The only problem is with these buttons is that they're incredibly clicky. And in a very trigger-heavy game, anybody sitting near you is probably going to start thinking that you're radioactive. Now, this sort of thing doesn't bother me too much, but I do know that this is an absolute deal-breaker for some people, and it will drive some people absolutely nuts just using these clicks. It can be a bit tricky to use these as well, but I think this is the sort of thing that you'll train yourself to do over time. It's not a deal breaker for me, and I can see why they've done it given the utility of this particular unit, because the magic of the 135 is its secret life, not as a horizontal handheld, but as a vertical Tate machine. I mentioned the extra buttons on the top and bottom of the console. These exist for Tate mode, and I'm not lying when I tell you that this is named after the Japanese word for vertical, straight up. But on its side, these buttons become your shoulder buttons. And in this mode, what you've actually got is a very pocketable version of the earlier 040. As well as Tate mode, this will also handle Nintendo DS games with one screen stacked on top of the other, and this works really well for the most part. There are the occasional games where they've been built because they're taking into account the gap between the screens, something like Sonic Rush or Contra. And those do look a little bit odd. I played Contra for a bit on here, and it wasn't terribly bad, but something like Sonic Rush is a little bit more dependent on that gap between the screens, and it just didn't quite sit right with me. Tate mode, on the other hand, is absolutely excellent. The screen is fantastic. I didn't have too much of a problem holding the device, although it does become a lot narrower when held vertically, and I did worry that that would be an issue. If you've got large hands, it might still be a problem, but because the unit is actually very light, I found it remarkably comfortable. One thing to note is that some games are not actually set up to play vertically, and you have to go into the settings menu in order to do that. For any game you want to launch in Tate mode, you have to highlight the game itself, press the Y button to enter its settings, go to screen rotation and press A. Choose vertical, press A, and then back out. Your game is now going to launch vertically instead of horizontally. One small annoyance is the placement of the speakers, which are perfectly fine if slightly annoying in a downward-facing position in horizontal mode, but in vertical mode they sit on the left-hand side of the device, and they mean that you're only getting sound from one side. Some people are going to find that a problem. Others, it won't matter to at all. Now, I didn't find that it killed the enjoyment of playing games myself, but your mileage is going to vary. This does have a headphone jack though, so if you do want to get that full stereo experience, that's an option, or even Bluetooth headphones. If you want a really good pocketable Tate experience, then this is probably the closest that you're going to get. It's not quite the same as the 040, but it's got an awful lot more power in it, and of course the ability to switch to horizontal mode, which the other one didn't have. But nothing we've talked about at the moment is particularly different from the myriad of handhelds that are on the market right now. But this device has a Helio G85 processor, and that should give every young boy in their mid-40s tingles in places that you shouldn't talk about in polite company. The 8 and 16-bit systems running through RetroArch have absolutely no problem playing here. PlayStation runs quite well, which you'd expect on a console with this much power. Sega Saturn, on the other hand, is a little bit of a compromised experience. It runs using the Yaba Senshero standalone app, and there are a good few games that you can actually get running quite well. The device does actually ship with all of these emulators installed and pre-configured, Although I do have to say some of these emulators are paid for apps, and I'm not entirely sure whether they've been licensed properly. Saturn games are a bit hit or miss as to whether they run or whether you get graphical glitches along the way. Probably the worst culprit was Panzer Dragoon, where the sky was completely missing, although this is a known issue on these Mali GPUs. Everything up to N64 ran surprisingly well. I didn't notice a lot of glitches or stuttering or slowdown. These systems represent a comfort zone, if you will, where the hardware is still sat with its pipe and slippers and a glass of whiskey in hand. N64 was actually a standout for me, and I've had a really good time exploring several titles in the catalogue. It's with the harder-to-run consoles, PSP and Dreamcast, where I started to see a bit of a problem. Now, the first thing that happened was in Dreamcast, where I noticed that there was a little pause every so often. It's almost like shaders compiling, if you're used to seeing that before. And I found that if I went and changed the core to the Flycast standalone app, which is included on the device by default, and then going into the settings and changing that to OpenGL, well, that solved the problem entirely. I had a similar stutter with the PSP as well, and unfortunately I couldn't fix it. When playing games like God of War and Tekken 6, you don't really notice it much. You might think of it as a bit of a glitch in between cutscenes or a moment or two when shaders are compiling, and then it's fine. But if you play a game like GTA Vice City Stories, you'll notice that every few seconds the whole game pauses just for a second and then continues. What's more, dropping this down to a 1x resolution didn't solve the problem. So whilst this chip is capable, and it will run games at a fairly locked 60 frames a second, your experience with that catalogue might change depending on the type of games that you want to play. Where optimism meets reality, however, is PlayStation 2 and GameCube. You know, it can handle lighter titles and some more, again, with a bit of tinkering. Maybe 40 to 50% of the catalogue will work kind of straight out of the box, but only really the lighter games. I was surprised to see Devil May Cry 2 and Crash Bandicoot Wrath of the Cortex running fairly well. Crash Bandicoot had a bit of slowdown issues, again, something I think you'd probably be able to fix, but I didn't have the time to test that out properly. I'd suggest don't buy this console if you really want to get, PS2 and GameCube, because some games will be absolutely brilliant. They'll surprise you. They'll run like a dream. Other games, maybe ones that are the ones that you want to play, maybe stuff that you think is pretty light and should run well, they're actually a lot more difficult to emulate. And it is a similar story with GameCube, and the real culprit is whether or not you can use the Vulkan backend. Some games are only going to run if you use OpenGL. Otherwise, you'll get graphical issues. And OpenGL takes a lot more processing power, which this device just doesn't have. I tested out Super Mario Sunshine, which got between 20 and 30 frames a second using the Vulkan backend, but in a game like Double Dash, you need to use OpenGL. And that can cause a little bit of a slowdown, which it didn't on the G90T or the Pocket Air Mini. It's here that we start to miss a second analog stick as well. Now, the second D-pad can be mapped as a substitute, and in games like Mario 64 and Super Mario Sunshine, Ace Golf, Crash Bandicoot, it actually worked very well. Although I can't remember whether it was already set up out of the box or whether I had to map it manually, but it can be done. But this is digital input rather than analog, so some games are going to work really well with this, and others are just not going to be worth your time. Personally, I wasn't a fan of 3DS on here, but that's largely because of the screen size. MagicX have set this up for you, and they're using a standard stacked screen layout, but there's no way to change that in the layout straight out of the box. It plays well, although you have to go through the same headache of shader compilation that you often do with 3DS games in Azaha anyway, and I found those occasional stutters did detract from some games, especially the driving ones. But if you wanted to pick this up with an SD card because it's kind of pick up and play, you'll still find yourself digging into the settings on things like Azaha if you prefer a different layout. One good thing about the extra buttons, though, is that they can be mapped inside Azaha. So I set my top button up to swap screen layouts and the L3 button up to swap screens, and that's worked for me quite well. What's surprising, though, is that PlayStation Vita can run quite well. Now, I've been sleeping on this console for quite some time because, quite frankly, when I tried it on much more powerful devices, the compatibility just wasn't there. And that's kind of the case here as well, but I'm pleased to say that some of the lighter titles actually run quite well. I should say I haven't done a lot of tweaking with this console because most of this was set up for me out of the box. All I had to do was load my ROMs onto an SD card and go. And that's one of the things that I really appreciate about these MagicX devices. Android can be a little bit awkward to set up, and some people just don't want the hassle of dealing with all of that. Here, you don't have any of that unless you really want to play those higher end systems. I also really like the experience of using the Dawn launcher. It's a little bit tricky to get your head round out of the box, the use of the shoulder buttons and triggers to navigate, but after a while it becomes second nature. Having this set as your home app means that you get an experience which is kind of very much like an Android operating system. You know, you don't feel that you're missing out on apps or an experience of using that, and yet you still have that nice look for a gaming front end. Another nice inclusion here is the Google Play Store. So if you've already got apps that you'd like to load onto your Android devices, you can do that without any hassles or sideloading. It's clear that MagicX have really thought through this device. They've made a smart little handheld, which is the perfect size to carry around with you on a daily basis. Now, it's not the most premium thing on the market, but it still has a really solid build quality and can deliver on a lot of systems. The only real downside, I suppose, comes with cost, because at $85, you now have some much heavier hitters that perform just slightly better at that price point. But regular viewers should know by now that I'm much more interested in trying to find out which part of the market this device serves. If you want an all-round, military-style console that could be everything that it can be, then this probably isn't the right choice for you. The fact is, this plays 3 systems exceptionally well. The Game Boy Advance, the vertical Tate arcade games, and actually the Nintendo 64. And along with that, you've got decent Nintendo DS emulation across a good chunk of the catalogue, and the ability to play it vertically without having to contort your fingers into pretzels just to reach the shoulder buttons. Despite the screen size, I actually found that it was pretty easy to read most of the stuff and interact with the systems. I don't have massive eye problems. Some people are going to find that's different. There are some games that buck the trend, but actually not as many as you may think. PS Vita was a nice surprise as well, and the few games that run look absolutely stunning on this screen. If you're looking for an upgrade from the 35XXH or even the R36H, but you don't want a vastly different form factor, then the MagicX 135 is actually a very interesting proposition. Personally, I'm actually quite excited about having something that you can take around with you that will play those arcade shooters. I've been trying to play 1941 on a handheld device for such a long time, it's nearly 1942. But that's what I think anyway, and I would love to know what you think as well. Let me know in the comments below if you're interested in the MagicX 135, if it's something that you've already picked up, or if it's on its way, or if it's something that on seeing this, you might be edging towards a different console. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and whilst you're down there, why not click that like button as well? Thank you ever so much for watching, and until the next video, you'll be able to find me on the loo playing with my MagicX 135. And now that I say that out loud, it actually sounds quite rude. Happy gaming.